The task of this response proved to be quite difficult, mostly due to my lack of general knowledge in the field of psychoanalysis and the high specificity of the theories presented. So lacking the capacity to really usefully expand on or even criticize Mr. Kückenhoff's speech, I first decided to pick some interesting thoughts from it and share with you my own reflections on the matter. I, of course, realize that by now any ideas put forth will be old news, but anyway, I took the text and I started to highlight ideas and concepts in Mr. Kückenhoff's speech that were both new and interesting to me, and finally ended up with a dozen or so bright and shiny yellow papers. And that was when I decided the smartest thing would be to try and relate set new ideas to my own personal experience with violence and hope that it would be of some interest to my audience. So my speech is not going to be scientific, but more portrait of how I personally conceive my surrounding society. And since I will be talking about things that happen or happened in my surroundings, I should give you a quick idea where I come from. I was raised in Zurich, which in the last decade was voted to be the best city in the world, as you may know, several times. But though I still consider it a rather safe place compared to other cities in other countries, youth violence has increased a great deal in the last decades. There are actually many places where it was no problem to go when I was a child, even, and where it would be unwise to do so in the present. And to give an example of this, a co-student of my little brother was actually stabbed in the central station last year, in midst of the central station in Zurich. So violence is not confined anymore to specific places in the city, but it's everywhere. In general, I have come across two forms of physical violence so far. The first always being related to the situation of argument and disagreement, which, paired with enough beer and spiced up a bit by a bad day or some latent aggression, have been known all too often to lead to non-verbal arguments, aka fights. I think that many people in this room may have experienced this firsthand, or else might have come close to having done so. I will not go into this spontaneous form of violence any further, since I think that it's more or less understandable for most people how a situation can develop a certain dynamic and escalate. What is important to notice, however, is that the people involved will actually know what the fight is about and why they've been invited to participate. Now I'll move on to a different form of violence, one that I myself have never had to endure directly, personally, but which has sadly afflicted many people I know and care about. Let me tell you two short stories as an example that happened to my younger brother. The first one took place some years ago. My brother Jonah was 13 years old at the time. He was walking home, and it was about 9 o'clock in the evening as he crossed a public space that I myself frequent almost daily and have done so all my life. Suddenly, he was jumped by two hooded guys, which he estimated afterwards to have been around the age of 18 and probably of Swiss origin. They knocked him to the ground, and one held him there, while the other carved the letter N into his right cheek with a razor blade. Needless to say that I, let alone him, was utterly shocked and enraged by this, and was full of anger and ready to go out and beat up whoever did this to my baby brother. And so, yes, the first thing that crossed my mind was revenge in form of violence. The second story is less gruesome, but all the more recent. Last month, Jonah, who is now 18, got attacked and beat up by two men of about age 20 or older, and came home with bruises, a black eye, and a swollen, bleeding lip. I should add that today he is all grown up and pretty strong himself, so his attackers ran off after having received more punches than they had anticipated. And Jonah wasn't much affected by this encounter like I would have been in his place, since things like this have happened regularly in the past years to him and many of his friends. I could recount to you numerous other occurrences where people I know were outnumbered and got beat up with fists, sticks, belts, or bicycle chains all over the city. What both of these stories have in common is that the offenders picked a victim, someone younger and alone, rather than an opponent, and that the selection of the victim was arbitrary, apart from making sure that they themselves would get out of it unharmed. Finally, what they share is that I completely lacked any kind of understanding for either of them. The only way I could imagine people who did things like this was for them to be somewhat inhumane, which is hard to maintain for a frequent phenomenon in the human society. But Dr. Küchenhoff offers alternative views and options to this problem. For example, the term action language caught my attention. Severe trauma in the, I don't even know if you did mention it, right? Since you shortened your speech. But severe trauma in the early life of a baby which cannot be handled mentally because it is not accessible to reflection is verbalized by action language. Also, the concept of destructive narcissism could provide a background or rather an explanation for destructive violence. The key phrase, "neither you or me but nothing," was offered as a summary for this, and apart from the interpretation delivered by the speech, it gave me other ideas as well. For example, I could imagine that someone, an adolescent, who feels constantly devalued by society and worthless or unappreciated by his surroundings, like family, the workplace, or school, feels like being treated as nothing and would try to bring this feeling onto other people as well. This may be a form of revenge or even justice to him, or a demonstration, a way of communicating his own situation to the world. If no one cares about him, why should he care about others? Why not make others feel as bad as he does, as powerless? Actually, power might also be a factor worth exploring. An ancient Japanese philosopher stated 5 prerequisites to become a man, and one of these was having the power to influence one's own surroundings. There are probably many adolescents who don't experience this kind of power all too often. School teachers, bosses, and parents are the people who maintain the power at home, in school, or at work, who take decisions, and one is sanctioned for disobedience to these authorities. So the need to feel powerful is present and strong. Violating someone else's sense and right of security and health is a very easy and potent way to satisfy this need, as the satisfaction of experiencing power oneself is increased even further by the direct sight and verification of the powerlessness of somebody else. This would be an example of reality change by violence. All of these theories and thoughts give me some tools to approach destructive violence, but the sheer amount of it that's happening weekly leaves me wondering, have that many babies been traumatized, and are that many adolescents feeling that powerless and devalued? And actually, I couldn't imagine. So I thought peer pressure could offer a valid explanation here. A young person who gets little recognition from society or is just misunderstood and searching for identity will look to his peers for the appreciation he feels he deserves. In his own circle, he feels respected or at least accepted, and so his circle is of greatest importance to him. His fellow adolescents are the only people who really understand his problems. Now, if one or more group members start propagating violence against others, and this is rewarded with respect by most of the group, and may it be out of fear of not being in, then the other members will feel compelled to act likewise. Violence is thus normalized and glorified to be a sign of particular strength, and the admiration and status one gets in the group correlates with how ruthless the action is. What will make this process even easier is if the same kind of violence was actually suffered by members of the circle, which is likely since they spend most of their weekends roaming around in town, so they feel like they are merely redoing or restaging something that has occurred earlier to themselves. Obviously, there are certain concepts that can explain destructive behavior. So, how can we use these psychoanalytical and all the other theories to improve the present situation? One preventive goal would be to make people, and especially adolescents in our society, feel better about their lives, to show more respect and recognition to them and other people in general. And then maybe they will act likewise. Of course, this is a lot easier said than done. But this solution, even if valid, would still leave today's problem of direct confrontation with destructive violence unaddressed. When one finds oneself surrounded by a group of violent offenders, it's too late for prevention. Is there an effective way to protect oneself from such experiences other than just staying home? Is a verbal solution fathomable or maybe even possible? Personally, I hope it is, and that I will get my hands on it someday. Until then, I wish you all good health and a minimum of violence in your respective lives, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Micha, and I ask you if you want to comment on the comments. Just.
Thank you very much for your comments and for further working with the ideas I offered. And I think it was very interesting. Let me add something generally. I am impressed by how this form of comment by the young scientists is fruitful, and I thank you very much for the comment. I would like to say, to give a fourfold reply. I think you mentioned one thing which I think is very important. You tried, and I think you did it brilliantly, you tried to understand the situation, the youth that apply violence are in. So understanding is the first thing. And in the end, that's the second point, you maintain that there's not an understanding in every situation, but there's something to be done immediately to stop the dangers implied and to do something which is apt to stop violence in a very direct way. And I think what I want to add is that that's not a contradiction. You have to, of course, you have to shelter yourself, and you have to do something against the imminent violence. The third point was that you hearing the violence your brother suffered, you had, as I think every one of us would have, the want to revenge, but you didn't.
Well, I can't say that I really was offered the possibility to. I can't say if I would have or not. Yeah.
But to not to react in the same way is, I think, something which is so important. And this, the last point was that you used the formula, what did the youth communicate with their violent acts? And this is part of the understanding. And that's very congruent to my paper, to try to action language. I don't know whether I mentioned it or whether I skipped it in my talk, to see, not to accept, but to see what is in acting violent, what is communicated by this behavior. It does not mean to accept violence or to withdraw from violence, but to try to understand what is communicated only this way, through this way, and not through any other way. And thank you again for the very personal answer you gave.
I can take some questions from the public.
Thank you. I was struck, Professor Küchenhoff, how we came to similar conclusions from different points of view. Well, I came from developmental psychology, you came from conceptual research, but much of what you said seemed parallel to my conclusions. So it gives me hope for the inter-psychoanalytic dialogue, which sometimes, as you may know, is necessary because psychoanalysis has become a very broad field with very different approaches. But both of us being clinicians, maybe this may also contribute to the similarity. Because if you see patients, you make these experiences and then you have to conceptualize it. So I think about mentalizing and you think about acknowledgement, following Derrida. I think also following Merleau-Ponty, if I don't go wrong with this philosophical background of yours. So the other point I wanted to make is that I was struck by the parallel comments of Mr. Gundelfinger and my commentator, Mr. Heim. You seem to be identified with your generation very intensively. I felt it like this. And sometimes with the back on the wall, somehow. You said, I feel like a part of a depreciated generation, being a violent and so on. And you said, I am part of a helpless generation. You know, in Zurich, violence is growing up to an amount that I could just, everything I am offered the opportunity to do. So, as you said in your last point. So I would summarize you as something like sons of a generation of non-warriors, post-war generation fathers, and you have now the problem of dealing with violence in your own generation, and that's heavy. And you need the fathers also. So you reacted with the reassurance, it is good to stop violence. Don't worry about that. As a psychiatrist and as a chief of a clinic, you know it is necessary to stop violence. You cannot have too much tolerance. I am always reminded of Otto Kernberg. He tells one example in his speeches. When treating a very violent patient in the beginning, he said to the patient, well, I am not ready to begin your treatment unless I am sure that you will not murder me. And he's really openly speaking to the patients about this problem, because I cannot treat you if I'm not sure that you will not murder me. So this is your point, I think. First, we have to be sure not to be murdered. But then we have to begin to think and have to begin to acknowledge the otherness of the other. That means to react with close and secure borders, but not with unconscious counter-aggression. This is our work.
I think that was not a question, that was a comment, and we have some more minutes to take some questions from the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I have never been confronted with violence of the type you're speaking about. And of course, it's a big question. And in my family, I think nobody seriously. And around me, nobody. So perhaps we are an exceptional exception, or perhaps not. And I would ask a simple question. Who is in this room has suffered a serious violence, aggression in his life? I mean, not in war or so, but in one of these civil exaction, I don't know, and one that say let some marks, a blue or a broken thing, or just not verbal, but something that left a mark. Please.
So we have a few hands, and
yes, please. Hi, just a moment. Yes.
well, I don't think that the number really are important.
Thank you very much.
Micha would like to comment on your question.
Well, my comment would be on the one hand that as it is a problem of more of our generation than of the older one, and that it occurs mainly in the evening while going out in town to parties or else in the city, I would not be surprised that if I would have thought that less people would have been affected from this audience. Plus, well, this is a thinkably bad cross-section of people from the general public. So
I agree.
It's not really.
I wonder what you implied with your question. This is not clear to me. You see, there are 2 points. When I came to Basel in 1994, there was a questionnaire asking in which parts of Basel do you feel insecure? And I laughed and said, no, I feel secure in this town, everywhere. And having lived in Basel and having worked in Basel in psychiatry, I wouldn't say it no more, because it's just dependent on the social surrounding you are in, whether you meet or not, whether you don't meet physical attacks or not. That's the one thing. And we are not only talking, and I didn't only talk about the very concrete physical attack, but I talked about other forms of violence as well. And if we would make an Abstimmung about these other forms of violence, there would be maybe another result.
Okay, I take one last question.
Yes. Good afternoon. I must admit that it's really amazingly interesting to see how the different pieces are coming together here in this meeting. It's excellent. I would like to make a step out and think about how I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, but NGOs, others may be othering people in other cultures by defining them or by projecting on them, like, for example, the idea of a normal childhood, that it is ours, and they would not have a childhood if they live differently. Or by defining them like victims, putting them labels. I would like to ask you, what do you think about this? We pretend that with the best intentions to go out there and helping people, but aren't we sometimes doing harm by labeling or othering people? I don't know if the question is... I think that violence goes clearly beyond the violence, the use of force, but it is discrimination, inequalities. All these things can bring violence, can be, or at least compared to violence, but also sometimes pretending with the best intention to help people by define them by victims. Are we really helping them? Or are we not othering them even more? I don't know.
I think you raise a very difficult question to answer, but a difficult question, an important question that we all have to ask ourselves, whether, well, by defining someone as a victim, what do we? Is that a form of victimization as well? That's a question.
Exactly. I think that if we come back, I don't know if this is still on, if we come back to the concept of resilience this morning, there is a lot of research showing that if we treat people like victims, that will certainly not enhance their feeling of having some power to influence their destiny. And so there is a whole discourse. You talked about language analysis or discourse analysis. There is a whole discourse in NGOs, humanitarians, but even in academics, I realize these days that is victimizing people, and then I'm not sure that this is really helping them. And therefore I'm questioning whether we are not othering them even more than what they really are.
But you have to look at the other side as well. Speaking clinically, not only clinically, it ever so often is important to acknowledge what has been done to someone. So to accept a real traumatic event as a traumatic event. That's the other side. So this wouldn't be victimization, but giving someone the chance to be accepted as someone who has suffered. And this is important as well. I think this is the other side of the metal.
Okay, I'm sorry to having to push the audience a little bit because we will have another presentation and I feel responsible to organize the full time also for our last speakers. Thank you very much again, and we'll see each other on the mountain tonight.